Good morning, everyone. Before I get started this morning with my sermon, I just want to say a big thank you to Caruso, to all the counselors and everybody that makes Caruso happen, and Devin. I just want to say thank you all for this great first year and this experience that I got to have. And so before we dive into our text this morning, I want to ask you a question. What or who are you listening to? Who are you listening to? For me personally, I love music. It's one of my favorite things on the planet, and no matter what I'm doing, I'm mowing my lawn, I'm taking a shower, I'm swimming in my pool, I'm always listening to some kind of music. I've always got something playing in the background. And I also listen to those around me. I try my best to listen to my parents, even though sometimes I might not want to listen to my parents. And I listen to my friends, whether it be at church or whether it be at school, and even though they might not be saying the most appropriate things or the best things for me to hear, I still listen. And so this morning, I want to introduce you to one of the kings of Judah who was pretty inconsistent when it came to listening. And that king is King Joash. So if you will turn with me to 2 Chronicles chapter 24. 2 Chronicles chapter 24. And while you turn there, I just want to give you like a brief little rundown on Joash's story because he's not too well known. So when Joash was born, there's a wicked queen named Athaliah who is ruling in Judah. And Athaliah tries to kill all of the royal family of the house of Judah, including her own grandchildren. But she misses one person, and that one little baby is King Joash. King Joash is safely hidden in the temple by his aunt and his uncle Jehoiada, the high priest, who his uncle plays a really important role in his story. And so after 6 years of Athaliah's wicked rule in Judah, Jehoiada the priest decides, okay, it's time for the real king to be on the throne. And he gathers all these Levites and arms them with weapons, and they protect Joash, and they crown him as king, and they kill Athaliah. And Joash begins his rule as king of Judah in a very good way because Jehoiada sets him up with a covenant. So Jehoiada sets a covenant up with him and the people and King Joash so that they will walk in the ways of the Lord, so that they are reminded to walk in the ways of the Lord. And that's what Joash does. I mean, he restores the temple after it had been desecrated by idol worship during Athaliah's rule. And the chronicler says that Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. So during this week at Caruso, one question that we had to answer one night was, who is your biggest role model and why? Or who is someone who made a positive impact on you? And many of us answered with our family members, our youth ministers, church friends, elders, teachers, professors, whatever it may be. And I want to ask you, who is your biggest role model? Who is your biggest role model? Because God also provides faithful examples for us, or these role models that you might be thinking of, for us to listen to and to follow alongside, just like Joash followed Jehoiada. God provides these good and these godly people within all of our lives to be the examples for us to try to emulate. And Joash ends up turning this wicked empire all the way back around to worship the Lord. He turns them all the way in the right direction by listening and by emulating his role model, Jehoiada. So I want to ask you, who are you listening to? Who are you listening to? If you will, we'll go to our text now. 2 Chronicles chapter 24, starting in verse 15. The chronicler writes, "But Jehoiada grew old and full of days and died, and he was 130 years old at his death. And they buried him in the city of David among the kings, because he had done good in Israel and toward God and his house." Moving on to verse 17. It says, "Now after the death of Jehoiada, the princes of Judah, and they paid homage to the king. And then the king listened to them." He listened to them. And the chronicler writes that when Joash listens to these princes of Judah, He forsakes God. He forsakes the God of his fathers. He worships idols. And he completely turns his life the wrong direction. Right the instant that Jehoiada dies, the very next verse, actually, Joash turns his ears away from his faithful role model into another source. In one instant, all of these lessons and these practices that Jehoiada instilled in Joash went right in one ear and out the other. But God does not give up there with Joash. Even after Joash has desecrated the temple, worshipped idols, turned away from God, God isn't silent. God still speaks to Joash. Verse 19 says, "Yet God sent prophets among them to bring them back to the Lord. And these prophets, they testified against them, but they would not pay attention." They did not listen. They did not listen. Are you listening? And so finally, God sends another prophet, Zechariah, who we find out is actually the son of Jehoiada the priest. Starting in verse 20 of 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verse 20, it says, "And the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, son of Jehoiada the priest, and he stood before the people, and he said," this is what God says, Why do you disobey the Lord's commands and keep yourselves from prospering? You have abandoned the Lord, and now he has abandoned you." And then the leaders plotted to kill Zechariah. And King Joash ordered that they stone him to death in the courtyard of the Lord's temple. And that was how King Joash repaid Jehoiada for his loyalty, by killing his son. And Zechariah's last words as he died were, "May the Lord see what they are doing and avenge my death." And that's exactly what God does. Immediately after Zechariah's death, Judah and Jerusalem are invaded by the Syrians, and ultimately Joash is wounded, and his own officials plot to kill him because he killed Zechariah the priest. And his own servants assassinated him as he lay in his bed. And so in Joash's life, God spoke to him through so many different people. You know, there were times where Joash listened to the right people, like Jehoiada. There were times where he listened to the wrong people, like the princes of Judah. And there were times where he didn't even listen at all. Are you listening? Because just like Joash, there are going to be times in our lives where we go down the wrong path. We forget the lessons and the practices that were taught to us by our role models. And we will end up turning our ears to a different source. We listen to the world, and we listen to the things of the world. And when God speaks, do you listen? When God speaks, will you listen? When you hear the media talk about certain hot topic issues that might go against our beliefs as Christians, for example, homosexuality or abortion, do you listen to the media, and do you give up your Christian beliefs? When that role model in your life gives you advice that's just really hard to hear, do you listen to them, or do you just ignore them and throw it away? When God gives us challenges in his word, like love your enemies, do you listen and do you go do that, or do you say, okay, I'll just do that later, that'll be next month, I'll do that when I'm done with school, or whatever your excuse may be? Who are you listening to? And if you're sitting here thinking, okay, Drew, God doesn't talk to us like he used to. It's not as easy as it used to be, you know. God doesn't send us prophets who blatantly say, okay, dude, you're forsaking the Lord. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. And God doesn't speak to us through burning bushes or through talking donkeys like he used to. And if that's what you're thinking, I get where you're coming from. But in Hebrews chapter 1, starting in verse 1, the Hebrew writer says that long ago at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, God has spoken to us by his Son. God's Son, who the Hebrew writer later says is the exact imprint of his nature. His Son, who is the radiance of God's own glory. His Son, who is seated on the right hand of the throne of God. And so if we truly fix our ears to what God says, and we try to do that with everything that we have, we will slowly become more and more just like Jesus. And God will begin to speak this message of salvation and this message of grace to those around us, with us as his witnesses.